Hello, Scrufftards. Welcome to Warzone. I'm Scruffy, and this is Scruffy Tales. And yeah, I'm feeling a bit under the weather here, not at peak capacity, but I wanted to make this video anyway. I had intended to do it last night, but I was just too tired, too sick to do it, so I'm gonna do it here anyway. Instead, I mean, and well, the Russians made a stupid, silly statement concerning the Great Northern War. And well, being a Swede, I need to deep dive into that shit. And but before we move on to that, I'm just gonna make a small announcement, a quick announcement. And that is that I'm starting a sort of a fundraiser thing here. A Swedish company. I have no cooperation with them whatsoever. Poltava, anyway. Poltava, a medical company in Sweden. They're providing the Ukrainian armed forces, with extremely high quality and vital trauma kits, backpacks, filled with everything a combat medic may need to instantly assist a wounded comrade and provide medical assistance if he's hit by bullets, shrapnel, explosions, whatever, and keeping him alive. And since the conditions in Ukraine are such that a wounded soldier may have to spend days in the trenches before he can receive a medevac, because the Russians are attacking military ambulances and medical vehicles, they need this high quality equipment in the front line, in the trenches, to keep wounded soldiers alive until they can be evacuated. And these bags are crucial in that effort. And if you're Swedish, you can head on over to Apotea directly. I will provide a link below, and you can donate money to donate and fund these backpacks. But I'm not sure it works for an international audience. I'm offering you a alternative, and that is to head on over to my Patreon. I haven't used Patreon at all whatsoever in the past, so I figured why not do it in this way instead. So head on over to my Patreon, and by choosing a membership subscription, that means you don't choose how much money you want to donate, right? So I take that money that you put into my Patreon, and then I slush it over to Apotea to help fund the trauma kits. And these backpacks are full of high quality stuff. The list on the right is in Swedish, unfortunately. I might try and update that at some point into English. But it's full of good stuff that the combat medics needs. So if you're from Sweden, head on over to Apotea. If you're from anywhere else, consider taking a look at my Patreon to help fund these very crucial trauma kits provided to the armed forces of Ukraine by Apotea. Right, now on to the point of the video. So I was made aware by this when I watched a video released by Ukraine Matters. And so it's not up to date. This happened a couple of days back, but it is just so goddamn silly. So the Moscow Times made this headline: Kremlin negotiator invokes Peter the Great's 21-year war with Sweden in Ukraine talks. So they're having talks with Ukraine, peace talks, and to make a point at how destructive it is to try and fight Russia, they bring up this war that took place 300 years ago, between 1700 and 1721. And it's just, oh my God. So the Great Northern War with Sweden lasted 21 years. 21 years, what the Russians say. They want to highlight this, that Russia was in this struggle with Sweden for 21 years and outlasted them, right? But just a few years after it began, Peter the Great offered peace to the Swedes. What did the Swedes say? No, we will fight to the last Swede, Medinsky said in an interview. Right, so this great war, 21 years, the Russians said, why don't we have peace? And the Swedes said, no, we will win. And the war lasted 21 years and Russia won. Ha ha ha, right? And he continues to say, we don't want war, but we're ready to fight for a year, 2, 3, however long it takes. We fought Sweden for 21 years. How long are you ready to fight? He apparently said in the negotiation room. So, right. So they're using the Great Northern War to highlight the superiority of the Russian military, how Russia can outlast anyone in war, how they are benevolent and trying to, we're offering peace. We're people of peace. We want peace. Don't fight us because we will fight on for however long it takes, right? And the point, if you take a look what happened during the Great Northern War, you quickly realize that all of this is pure propaganda. It's pure bullshit. And so that's why we're going to take a look at it. We're going to take a look at the Great Northern War. And if you're a history buff, feel free to correct me down below in the comments or fill in and, stuff I forget, whatever. So anyway, yeah, I'm sick. I'm rambling. It is what it is. Let's head on over to some maps. So what happens is this is roughly Europe in the year of our Lord 1700. So here is Sweden, the Swedish Empire. This is Russia. Some decades earlier, there had been a massive war here in the center of Europe, right in the middle of all the German states, the 30-year war between Catholics and Protestants. And this war solidified Sweden as one of the military superpowers of Europe. Gustavus Adolphus was the king that brought the destruction to Germany and the Catholic forces. He is also known as the father of modern warfare. And this war solidified Sweden's position as a military superpower. And Sweden built on this army, this reputation, and what have you, yada, yada, yada. And so you have a couple of kings, and they die, and Sweden's left with a 14-year-old boy king, Charles XII. And all the enemies surrounding Sweden, they think, okay, now is our time to take territory from Sweden. So you have here, this is Denmark, having occupied Iceland and Norway. Denmark wants to essentially push in and take the south of Sweden, right? Because that's old Danish territory. And then you have Poland, Lithuania, Saxony. The king, is he the king of Saxony? He is also the ruler of Poland, Lithuania. So you have Poland, Lithuania over here, and Saxony over here somewhere. And they want to push up and take control over the Baltic states. There's some disputes between the Baltic nobles and the government in Sweden. So this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth sees an opportunity to push in and grab territory here in the Baltic states from the Swedes. And the Russians, what is it that the Russians want? They want a port right here in the Gulf of Finland. They have ports up here, but these get frozen during half the year, during winter, right? So they want a port here that doesn't freeze over during winter, that allows trade, continuous trade by sea. This is really important for the Russians. They need to have open trade routes at sea all year round. So they want this piece of land right here so that they can build a big port in this area to conduct trade to the west. So that is what Denmark, Poland, Lithuania, Saxony, and Russia wants. They want to take these territories from Sweden. And they all join together to launch an assault on Sweden, and they do when the boy king is 18. Thinking this will be easy, right? What happens is that the Danes, for whatever reason, instead of pushing across here, they attack into Swedish positions in Germany, thinking that their navy will keep them safe. The they don't realize, well, the British send a fleet. The Brits wants the trade lanes to remain open. A war between Denmark and Sweden, it's going to lock down trade in the Baltic. The Brits, the English, they don't like that. So the Swedes make a deal with the British Navy. Hey, we can finish this really fast if you let us transport across the ocean and, lay siege to the Danish capital. And the Brits say, yeah, that's a smooth solution. Let's do that. That will bring an end to the hostilities real quick. So the British allow the Swedes to cross the ocean, bypassing the Danish Navy. Swedes land right next to the Danish capital, while the Danish army is down here. Denmark is kicked out of the war. Sweden forces Denmark to leave the war. At the same time, you have the shenanigans here in the east, with the Russians laying siege to a town called Narva. It's located right here. Let's see if we can mark it. Narva is right here. And this is where Tsar Peter has moved in with his army. They're besieging the Swedes at Narva. And you have the Poles pushing up and making shenanigan deals with the Baltic nobles. So Charles XII, he interestingly, he was the first Swedish soldier to set foot on Danish soil during the invasion. He will be known as a warrior king. He is always leading the charge, taking the lead. He sleeps and eats with the soldiers the same food. He is very much a soldier more than a noble king, right? He is a warrior, a general, a soldier. Same thing when they come over to the Baltics here in the middle of winter, make landfall. Again, Charles XII is the first to set foot on these contested areas, and then they begin the push to Narva, and the Russians are like, what, the Swedes are already here? Jesus Christ. And it's a blizzard, and the day before the battle, as news reaches the Russians that the Swedes are about to attack them, Tsar Peter leaves the battlefield. He skedaddles out of town, and now you have the Russians readying their defenses for a Swedish assault, and the Swedes assault through the blizzard and completely obliterates the Russian army. The Russians outnumber them 4 or 5 to 1, and it's a slaughter. And the Russians are forced to retreat. So the Russians are essentially knocked out of the war at this stage, because the Russians, they fall back to Russia, and the Swedes at this point decide it's time to take on Poland, Lithuania, and marches south into Poland to deal with these pesky Saxon, Polish, Lithuanian troops and their Russian allies. And you have several battles down in Poland, Lithuania. You have the Battle of Fraustadt, for instance, where the Swedes have 9,000 troops. They face a Saxon Russian army of 20,000. The Swedes do not fire a single shot with their infantry. They charge into close combat, and Sweden loses 400 troops. They take 8,000 prisoners, and they kill 8,000 Saxon and Russians. The infantry didn't fire a single. Remember, this is a war when you rely on muskets and cannons. And the Swedes charged into combat, close combat, with bayonets and rapiers, lost 400 of their own, and the Saxon Russian army had 8,000 killed and wounded, and Sweden took 8,000 casualties. Isn't that astonishing? Worth mentioning, Sweden did a classic encirclement with cavalry as well, defeating the enemy cavalry and then coming in behind enemy infantry. It was a complete massacre. And this is basically what we're seeing throughout the Northern War. Sweden being outnumbered 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, and racking up victory time and time again, despite being outnumbered significantly on the battlefield. So the Swedish army was elite, it was professional, and had very extremely capable officers leading it. And they had this larger-than-life king that, followed the troops into battle and led the charge. And essentially, uh, Sweden ignores Russia for the most part. They knocked Russia out early at Narva. Tsar Peter fled, and they have no respect for the Russians. They want to deal with this more personal threat, or with the Polish Lithuanians. Sweden and Poland has had decades of animosity, and now it's like this is a stab in the back by the Polish. It's time to settle this once and for all. So Charles XII completely ignores Russia. He can deal with them at a later time. So while Sweden is down here dealing with what they consider to be the greater threat, a more personal fight, this is when the Russians sneak in behind the Swedes once again to try and take territory up here in the Gulf of Finland. And so Russia, while Sweden is down here and destroying enemies left and right, Russia sneaks in behind here and takes a Swedish fort right here. Right there is where they seize a Swedish fort and begin to build a town. There's no official peace. They haven't officially secured the territory, but they start building a town nonetheless. While the Swedish army is occupied in Poland, Lithuania. And this town would become known as St. Petersburg, right? The city of Tsar Peter himself. Because this is going to be the important trading port that Russia can rely on to keep trade open all year round with Western Europe, with the superpowers in the West. But Tsar Peter, he realizes that, Sweden is kicking ass all over Europe. And if Sweden ever decides it's time to deal with the Russians, which they will, since Russia is trying to occupy territory, if the Swedes decide to push towards Russia, it is over. It's done, right? So now we come into how the Russians were offering peace and the Swedes said no. And they're like, we were so benevolent. Right? That's what this told the Ukrainians. We offered peace, but no one wanted this. So Russia pushes in, they join a coalition that declares war on Sweden, and then Russia tries to steal land from Sweden. And now Russia offers peace to Sweden. Russia has lost multiple battles here in the Baltics, and they've tried to help the Polish Saxon alliance here, and it's not going well for anyone that is opposing the Swedes. So they are now offering peace deals to Sweden. And all Russia wants is St. Petersburg. They want to keep St. Petersburg, and everything else is definitely negotiable. They are bending over backwards. Sweden can have pretty much anything Sweden wants as long as Russia keeps St. Petersburg. And the Swedish king is like, hang on. You attacked me. You have stolen my land. I am winning every battle. Why should I accept a peace deal? Why should I let you steal territory from me when I'm winning the war? So Sweden, declines time and time again. Russia even sends emissaries to the United Kingdom and France, to the British Empire and France, asking these superpowers to help Russia negotiate a peace deal with Sweden. That should tell you the level of power Sweden held at the time, when you had to bring in the big boys of the world, the British Empire and the French, to take part and sit down and talk with Sweden. Sweden is a military superpower on par with anything that the British and French can field, right, militarily. But Sweden now says no, time and time again. Doesn't matter what the Russians tell the French and the British. And the Swedes say, no, we're not having it. They started this war. They're going to have to suffer the consequences. And the Russians are like, God damn it, God damn it, God damn it. This is not good. And eventually, Sweden deals with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Saxony, and they surrender. And now it's time for Sweden to deal with Russia. Russia is still holding on to territory around St. Petersburg. They're still building St. Petersburg, taking Finns and Lithuanians and Estonians, and Estonians, I guess it is up here, right? So Finns and Estonians as slaves, and building this city on the bones of the slaves they've taken from Finland and Estonia, and from the rural areas of Russia as well, to be perfectly honest, right? So now the Swedes have their sights aimed at Russia. It's time to deal with this insignificant threat, this military that just flees, that is vanquished en masse whenever the Swedes face them in battle. And Tsar Peter, who has fled from King Charles on the eve of battle, he fled, and afterwards he has snuck in behind and sneakily stolen territory, and then he's begging for peace. I mean, in the eyes of the Swedes, the Russians are cowards, they're incompetent, and they're led by a feeble Tsar, and it's time to deal with them in the only way Sweden knows how to, by destroying the Russian Tsardom completely. So Sweden intends to march on Moscow. Where is it? Somewhere over here, right? Going through from Poland, Lithuania, through modern-day Belarus, straight at Moscow. And the main army will be linking up with the supply train coming in from the Baltics, bringing supplies and reinforcements, and they will link up and then push for Moscow. Now, you may go, haha, silly, why would they think that? But the thing is, about 100 years earlier, roughly, the Poles successfully pushed through Russia and seized Moscow. And how did the Russians liberate Moscow? Well, they were helped by a Swedish force. So Sweden marched on Moscow and kicked the Poles out. So, I guess Russia can thank Sweden for that as well, apart from creating that bullshit country with the Vikings. Anyway, stay on point. So this is the Swedish plan. Sweden knows that their army is superior to the Russian. They know they can defeat the Russians in any engagement. What they need is to just bring in enough supplies halfway along the way so they can keep marching. And a couple of things happen along the way. One interesting thing is you have two interesting battles. Tsar Peter overlooks the defenses of a river. I believe it's somewhere here at the start of the campaign, and they are taken. It's during winter. They are taken by surprise as Swedish cavalry charges across the river, across the frozen river, and begin to assault the Russian vanguard. And it is Charles XII that is leading this Swedish cavalry charge. And the funny thing is, it is Tsar Peter himself that is overlooking the defenses being built at this river. So here you have and what happens is that the Swedes take the Russians by surprise, and the Russians flee. They're outflanked by Swedish cavalry. They have no clue how many Swedes are going to follow across the river. So the Russians flee, and Tsar Peter once again runs away from Charles XII. This is the second battle where Charles XII shows up and Tsar Peter runs away. So, I mean, in the eyes of Charles XII, it is clear Peter is a coward. He just keeps running away. The Russians keep being crushed. And the Russians outnumbered the Swedes, and at this point with 3 or 4 to 1. It was a small cavalry raid that forced a much larger Russian contingent to run away. So, I mean, time and time again, it is proven that the Russians are no match for Swedes, and this is the second time that Tsar Peter himself flees from the king of Sweden on the field of battle. So the Swedes continue pushing through Belarus. They reach another river, I don't know, somewhere over here maybe. And this is where we're going to have another battle, a more proper battle. The Russians are lined up, they defend a couple of bridges, the Swedes spread out, and the Russians realize that the Swedish right flank in this battle is exposed. So the Russians come up with a plan. We're going to send in our elite guard regiments, right? The best troops we have, professional soldiers, to strike at the exposed right flank of the Swedish army, secure it, and that means we can swing up and attack the Swedes on the flank. So the Russians wanted to roll up the entire Swedish line by attacking the exposed right flank. So the Swedish line is something like this. We have a bunch of, there's a river and some bridges, and then you have a unit out on the right flank securing the right flank, and the king is in a village behind the main line at this point. And the Russians, they gather 3 or 4 of their elite guardian regiments, and the plan is to attack the Swedish exposed right at dawn when most of them are asleep, and you're also going to send down Russian cavalry to isolate the Swedish right flank. And the Russians set the plan in motion, and they attack and they surprise the Swedes at dawn. The Swedes don't know what's happening. They scramble their troops trying to get their lines in order, and then the Russian elite guard units, 3 or 4 regiments, charge in to overwhelm the Swedish encampment on the extreme right. And the Swedes fight back. They fight hard to hold the Russians at bay, and then eventually reinforcements are deployed to the battle. The Swedish regiment, the Skaraborg regiment, shows up and charges in using go-på tactics and smash into the Russian formations. And the Swedes push the Russians back. After hard fighting, the elite guard units of the Russian army are forced back, and they get pushed into a swamp. They are unable to maneuver. They're stuck in the ground, and the Swedes begin to pick them off one by one. It is a massacre, and the elite units of the Russian army are wiped out on this morning at the Battle of Malatitse. And in the end, of course, after this disaster, with the elite guard units destroyed, the Russians are eventually forced away from Malatitse, and the Swedes can continue the march towards Moscow again. The Swedes are reassured that they are superior to the Russians, and the Russians cannot stand against them on the field of battle. The Russians are cowards, and they are inferior compared to the Swedish army. So, reassured that the Swedish army is superior to the Russians, and Tsar Peter is a coward. Remember, he has fled twice now from the Swedish king on the field of battle. The Swedes have their eyes set on Moscow. They will keep pushing towards the Russian capital. And now all they have to do is wait for the supply train to reach them, pushing through the Baltics. So the Swedes stop. I've forgotten the name of the town, but they stop and they wait for the supply train to link up, because then they're going to have food, ammunition, gunpowder, and additional manpower to reinforce them to make the push towards Moscow. The Russians, they realize they can't face the Swedes on the field of battle. It's impossible. So they have to try and reduce Sweden's fighting capability until you have a decisive battle. And this is when Russia realizes we need to do scorched earth. And this is essentially the first time they implement scorched earth. So what they do, they burn everything, farms, kill animals, burn crops, and fall back and retreat and avoid fighting. Just imagine what that means. That means Russia, instead of fighting the invading force, Russia decides to attack its own civilian population, burn homes and that peasants rely on to stay warm at night and during winter, and they burn crops and kill animals, taking away food from Russian peasants, so putting them into starvation, into poverty, making them homeless, burning down everything they own. That is what the Russian army does. It brutally attacks its own civilian population, dooming thousands, tens of thousands of Russians to die from starvation and to live their life, the rest of their lives in poverty, while the Russian army is fleeing from the invading force. Benevolent rulers, right? So that's what the Russian army does. It attacks its own civilians brutally while fleeing from the invading army. So Sweden, King Charles and the Swedish army, they make camp in a town, I forgot the town, and then they wait for the supply train to reach them because they're running out of supplies. No worry, when the supply train arrives, we will restock and push on, right? But it's winter and spring and mud season, rain, sleet, snow, and what have you. It's a messed up combination. So the Swedes wait for a month, I think it is, and the supply train doesn't show up. And the King Charles, he's like, the longer we wait, the more time the Russians have to build defenses and build an army, and we need to move. We need to move out and head and make things happen. But they realize they also need food and supplies, right? That is when the plan is hatched to march south into modern-day Ukraine and reach Poltava, is a town that exists to this day in Ukraine. So march south to Ukraine, modern-day Ukraine and Poltava, gather resources and supplies, and maybe even make allies among the Cossack population that is hostile to the Russians. So that is the plan. So the Swedes march south to find supplies for the army instead of marching on Moscow, because they don't know when the supply train will arrive. And this is the moment when Sweden makes the fatal decision that will, in the end, result in them losing this war, the Great Northern War. Had the Swedish army waited 3 more days, the supply train would have reached the encampment and they could have pushed on Moscow. Instead, the Swedish army marches south. The supply train and the reinforcements reach the site for the base camp 3 days later, and they have to now try and follow the main force south and try and catch up. So the supply train, with all the reinforcements, push south, trying to follow the main force, and the Russian army is of course trailing the Swedes, because they know they have scouts, they know what the Swedes are doing, so they're following them southward. And this is when Tsar Peter and his generals receive word that the Swedish reinforcements and supply train, they're like a couple of days behind the main force. And it's a much smaller force than the main army. So that is when the Russians decide, let's divide and conquer. So Russia sets up an ambush at a river crossing where they push in and attack the supply train at this river crossing, and it is a successful ambush, and the Swedes are forced to fall back. They're forced to leave all the supply trains behind, all the supply wagons behind, in order to save the troops. They can't bring all those heavy supplies with them if they want to fall back and rearrange lines, and if they want to have a chance of linking up with the main force. So Russia successfully seizes control over the Swedish supply train at this river ambush. And this is now when the Swedish army begins to suffer. During the march south towards Poltava in modern-day Ukraine, the Swedish army suffers from starvation and sickness. They have no supplies. They can't find enough food to keep to sustain the army. And of course, when they do reach Poltava, the Russians decide this is where we can fight them, and Russia pushes in to face the Swedish army. Now, I think if we take a look at the total number of troops available in the area, Sweden has roughly 20,000, and Russia has now overall in total 80,000 troops, maybe 100,000 troops that can be brought in and help out with the battle and what have you. Now we all know that the Swedish army loses this this major decisive battle at Poltava. But there was a moment prior to the battle beginning that could have changed the course of history, quite literally. So down in modern-day Ukraine at Poltava, the Swedish and Russian army, they decide here this is where the fight's gonna be. The Russians begin to build defenses and what have you at the town of Poltava, and the Swedes like, yeah, this is it. This is when we're gonna fight. Now we have the Russians where we want them, basically. And the Swedes realize that the Russians are gonna cross a river further to the, I think it's to the north of the Swedish position. So they realize that this is gonna happen. The Russians are gonna move in north of our position, and that is when we can strike them when they're the weakest. This is what the Scottish did against the British at the Stirling Bridge. The British force, the English force, was much more powerful than the Scottish army at Stirling Bridge. But when the English started crossing the bridge, I mean, they had to essentially divide their forces. They couldn't bring the full army to bear, and the Scots attacked and destroyed the English piecemeal, because the English could only push so many troops at once over the bridge. And the Swedes at Poltava essentially had the same idea. The Russian army is going to cross a fording, shallow waters in the river. That is when we will hit them with our cavalry and just chop them down piecemeal and reduce Russian numbers, and that will give our infantry all the odds they need to successfully defeat the Russians in open battle. So I think it's General Rensköld that is in command of the Swedish cavalry. They move up, they take position, and they can see the Russians crossing the river. And they are like, yep, this is it. We're going to charge in and decimate them. And this will set the stage for the infantry to later on destroy the Russians in the proper battle. But Rensköld gets word that the king has been shot. Charles XII had taken a bullet to the, or a musket ball to the foot, completely destroyed the foot while he was inspecting the front lines. And so Rensköld receives word the king is probably fatally wounded, because the doctors feared that the wound was so severe it would kill the king. So Rensköld at this point calls off the ambush and leads the cavalry away from the Russian forces. He must return to check on the king. And this, of course, has a tremendous impact on the battle itself later on. So then you have the Battle of the Battle of Poltava, where you have sick and hungry Swedes attacking Russian defensive positions. The Russians have built defenses. The Russian defenses look something like so, and then they have a town behind the defenses, and then they have an artillery line. And the Swedes, the plan is to bypass the Russian defenses and line up. So the plan is to bypass the Russian defenses, line up behind them, and assault the artillery line and the town and force Tsar Peter to flee. It doesn't go as planned. The Swedes get stuck on the Russian defenses. They can't, there's confusion as they begin to slowly move past the Russian lines, and they gather up piecemeal behind the Russian defensive line as intended, and then they charge the artillery line, taking casualties, pushing up against the cannons. They seize the cannons, but then the Russian counterattack is launched out of town into the weakened Swedish line at this point, and the Swedes are forced to withdraw. You have Swedish cavalry that are lost in some woods, as well as they're trying to outflank the Russians. It's the battle itself is a disaster. The Swedes are too tired, too hungry, too sick, and you have some chain of command that has broken down, and the Russians have, the main defensive line here that the Swedes have to overcome. Once the Swedes overcome the defensive line, they have an artillery line that they have to overcome, and behind the artillery line, you have a fortified town with infantry that now counterattacks. So Poltava was too much for the Swedish army to handle. And like I said, had Rensköld managed to decimate the Russian forces a couple of days earlier, things might have looked different down at Poltava. But the Swedish army was defeated and had to retreat, and the Swedes actually retreated into the Ottoman Empire to a town called Bender. And if you wonder how capable the Swedish army was, a couple of months later, the Swedes had recuperated, they had eaten, they were now healthy and well fed and rested. And eventually the Ottomans decided it's time to kick Charles XII and these pesky Swedes out of our empire. They're not welcome anymore. So they try and do this with force, right? So they send in a couple of thousand troops to deal with the what remains of the Swedish army, and the Swedish army defeats the Turkish forces, right? So when the Swedes were well fed and rested, you could not defeat them. They were unstoppable. So that should tell us just how incredibly important it was for the war effort when the Swedes decided to march south towards Poltava instead of waiting 3 more days for the supply train to reach them. Of course, they didn't know that the supply train was 3 days out, but had they had waited a month. Imagine if they had waited those last 3 days. What a difference that would have made to world history. I mean, this decision is, still affecting us today, because since Russia won at Poltava, we saw the decline of the Swedish Empire, and this allowed Russia to secure, in the end, St. Petersburg, and St. Petersburg became part of the Russian Empire, and Russia could now build up its wealth and its society with trade coming in through St. Petersburg, right? This port here is what builds the Russian Empire proper for the next decades. And I mean, without this port, without Russia securing St. Petersburg in the Great Northern War, if that had not happened, more than likely Russia would have been a backwater country, even today, without being a massive threat to world peace. And it all comes down to Sweden not waiting 3 days for the supply train to catch up with them. Isn't that amazing? 3 days that changed the course of history forever. Just incredible. And then, of course, the Russians say, haha, we fought on for 21 years, right? Okay. So what happens? Sweden loses at Poltava, falls back to the Ottoman Empire, stays here. Is it a couple of years? I can't remember. Anyway, so the war continues to 1721. Not because, the tenacity or iron will of the Russians. At this point, after 1709, it is the Swedes are on the back foot. And it is Sweden that refuses to surrender. Remember, Russia started the war together with the Danes and the Saxons and the Poles, right? It is Sweden that for 21 years refuses to surrender. Even, because Russia has moved in and stolen territory from the Swedes, and the Swedes are refusing to surrender that territory to Russia. Russia tried for 9 years to have peace with the Swedes, and, because, they were losing every battle. So Russia was trying desperately to have peace with the Swedes because the Swedes were winning the war. And when the Swedes were beginning to lose the war, Sweden didn't surrender because Russia had territory that belonged to Sweden. So how does the statement here from the Russians make any sense whatsoever. They're like, we offered Sweden peace because we're benevolent or something, right? That was not the situation. They offered peace because they got their asses kicked. And then we fought on for 21 years. Yeah, but Sweden was the country being invaded, and Sweden was the country that was defending territory you were trying to steal. So Sweden was the country that held out for 21 years, not Russia, right? Sweden held on for 21 years, not Russia. And Russia had something like, I think Ukraine Matters pointed out that Russia had 14 million people living in Russia at the time, and Sweden 1 million. So Sweden was vastly outnumbered and could not sustain, or shouldn't have been able to sustain a war for 21 years against an enemy that outnumbered them 14-1. But Sweden did. Sweden held the line basically for 21 years. And now, 300 years later, Russia is like, yeah, we offered them peace and we fought them for 21 years. I mean, Russia started the war. Russia tried to steal territory. Russia begged for peace when they were losing the war. And Sweden desperately fought on for 21 years trying to defend their borders. Yeah, it's insane how Russia lies and spreads bullshit via their propaganda, trying to make it out as Russia was some form of, superpower at the time, or that they were that Sweden invaded Russia without cause, and Russia was, the victim of the Great Northern War. No. Russia joined in on a coalition against Sweden, attacked Sweden, and tried to steal territory from Sweden. And Sweden responded and reacted. Right? Say Sweden had accepted peace early on. What then? Then Russia would have lost several major battles. Sweden would be able to dictate terms to Russia, and Russia had gained St. Petersburg. Those were the terms of the peace agreements. But I mean, then the Great Northern War would have been a huge win for Sweden, and Russia would have had massive losses on the field of battle, and Tsar Peter himself would have fled on a couple of occasions from the Swedish army. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So, I mean, what made Sweden lose was hubris. Sweden thought that God was on their side and that they could not lose, and, that Russia was feeble, incompetent, and cowardly. That was the reason why Sweden lost the war in the end. Hubris. And that they did not wait 3 days after having waited a full month. Rambling, but I mean, it pisses me off. It pisses me off that they are trying to rewrite history, the Russians, to suit the narrative. It's the same thing when with the Winter War. When talking about World War II, Russia didn't do anything wrong in Finland. Russia didn't do anything wrong in Poland. No. But oh my God, the Germans attacked Russia with Operation Barbarossa, right? Those damn Germans. So Russia's part in World War II is all about fighting Germans and helping the Allies win the war. Ignore Finland, ignore Poland, right? Lies, deception, propaganda, and complete fucking bullshit. That's all you ever gonna get from the Russians. Yeah, so that's it. It just pisses me off. I was gonna record this last night, but yeah, I mean, being sick, I was too tired to do it. I just wasn't up for it. But I hope you found it interesting. Hope that explains a bit. And if you enjoy history, leave a comment down below. I'm sure I messed things up here. I'm doing this on the fly and without any notes and anything. Just, trying to pick things out of memory here while being sick. So please feel free to add comments and pointers about what took place during the Great Northern War, and inform viewers and readers just how much Russia is lying about history to fit a certain narrative to trick Votniks and uneducated people. Anyway, that's going to have to be it. As always, Go på marsch, Ukraine, and give them hell.